AMD versus Nvidia, the GPU war, one of the most pointless conflicts in history, only perhaps eclipsed by the console wars which have become a farce in this day and age when both main consoles use variations of the same hardware. Though it seems clear Sony has won that one as much as one can win such a farce. With respect to the GPU situation, there is a clear winner. Unlike with CPUs, where there is genuine competition and decisions to make as a consumer. But with GPUs, the only real choice, the only sensible choice, is Nvidia. Unless, of course, you wish to believe in the nonsense that is being spread online by quite a few people, who in reality are looking for any and all excuses because they are angry with Team Green and are looking for a serious competitor. But it does not exist, and it's precisely why Nvidia has handled their GPU releases for the last half-decade so poorly. But endorsing the fiction of there being a serious competition in the GPU sphere will not change that.
Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about AMD versus Nvidia, the GPU war. Well, not so much of a war because Nvidia has been dominating the GPU market for well over half a decade. I'd say since the 10 series, they really have taken the lead in a substantial way. If we look at the Steam hardware survey, we can see that Nvidia has about 76% of the entire GPU market under their control. And that is something they have certainly taken advantage of. The 20 series was not great. The first series, you can find the GPUs, and even if you could find them to purchase them, they were like over $2,000 for a 3080. And now we have Nvidia looking at the 30 series and saying, well, if the prices at retailers are going to be substantially higher than the MSRP, let's just raise the MSRP. And they have raised the MSRP by a fairly substantial amount, resulting in situations right now where if you're buying a computer, you're going to probably spend more than half the price of your entire computer on the GPU alone. In fact, the main motivating factor for me making this video was originally I wanted to make a video on building a high-end computer. And then you realize that, well, the vast majority of the money you're going to spend in that computer is going to come from the CPU, which obviously includes the motherboard and the memory, and of course the GPU. Now, on the CPU side of things, there are pros and cons between AMD and Intel, though I would say right now, if you're building a high-end gaming computer, you probably want to go AMD. Unless you have a lot of money, then that's a different discussion, but if you're a normal person, you do have some limits, some reasonable limits on how much money you want to spend on a computer, then probably going AMD for a high-end gaming computer is the way to go, at least with one particular processor. That might be a video that I do make after this one. But on the GPU side of things, it isn't a competition, at least on the high-end side of things. I would not necessarily purchase a 4060. Like, if you want to save money, I'd probably buy like a 30 series GPU because you can get that significantly cheaper. Like, you can probably get like a 3080 for about the same price like a 4070, certainly or a 4060. That is something that is available right now, and you got to keep that in mind. Like, if you want to save money, buying the previous generation is generally going to be something that does save you a lot of cost and give you better components in general, as opposed to like buying the 4060 or something along those lines, or the 3060 in the previous generation. Though many people apparently disagree because some of the most popular GPUs on Steam are like the 3060s, the 2060s, the 4060s, the 3050s. It's not necessarily something I agree with, but people are like, oh, how do we save money? They buy a cheaper card. Well, you could buy a pretty good card from a previous generation that is about the same price, and it is going to be better. Sure, it's used, and that comes with its own issues, but you can find a lot of them for a sale right now. That said, there are certainly some advantages with buying even a 4060 at the moment, given certain Nvidia technologies. Now, let's take a look at how things are right now from an objective standpoint. People will say, or the tech media will give plenty of reasons why there is a competition, and they're not wrong necessarily, but I think they ignore some critical factors. The tech media focuses a lot on 4K gaming benchmarks, which are played. The vast majority of people are not going to game in 4K. They can't afford it, they can't afford the displays, they can't afford the computers for it, and even if they can afford a good GPU for 4K gaming, they're going to end up limited because, well, maybe they don't have the money for a CPU, for instance, or memory situations, or well, storage is relatively cheap, but obviously there are problems when that. If you have a lot of money to spend on the problem, sure, is viable to game at 4K. And there are certainly some advantages that AMD does have. The memory situation is in AMD's favor compared to Nvidia, and their rasterized performance, or their non-ray trace, non-upscale, non-frame generation performance, which the vast majority of games do use, is better or on par with Nvidia, because AMD knows it's, from a technological standpoint compared to Nvidia, like on ray tracing, for instance, they know they're one generation or maybe even two generations behind Nvidia. So they're trying to make up for that for pure performance in terms of rasterized performance. But here's the thing about that. Well, that's certainly the case. It's not like a 4080 versus an XTX 7900 is necessarily going to struggle. There are certain games where obviously the XTX can do better, but most of the time their performance can be considered on par, or maybe you get like, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 or more FPS. In some games you do get a substantially higher performance increase, like Call of Duty, certain Call of Duty games, or the remastered Call of Duty games. But for most part, the performance is on par. But then the tech media says it's like, oh, it's $100, $200 cheaper. Okay, but you get a lot more than just that kind of performance between AMD and Nvidia when you're purchasing Nvidia. And that's what I want to talk about. And by the way, when we're talking about that performance, a 4070 Ti, which is cheaper than the XTX, is actually comparable at 1440p performance to that XTX 7900. So, always talking like, what's the best budget value? What's the best value GPU? That's, honestly, I would say that's a load of bullshit from the tech media, especially when you consider regional pricing, where you might not have a price advantage for AMD versus Nvidia, or AMD versus Intel. Like, one of the things I hate about the tech media is say, oh, AMD is cheaper. It's like, that is not the case for a lot of people around the world. Depends which country we're talking about. Depends on what the regional price is. Depends on the component as well. Sure, at the moment, in my country, in Romania, I can buy an XTX 7900 for cheaper than a 4080, but it depends on the model, depends on the cooler, depends on what I'm willing to tolerate when it comes to that, depends on the company that's ultimately making that GPU, like the company that's handling the cooler, the AIBs. It does depend a lot. Or, I can even find some 4080s are comparable in price to some XTX cards. Depends what you're going for. Keep that in mind. There's a lot of discussion to be had on price, but let's say in the United States, okay, you can get an XTX cheaper than a 4080. Fair enough. And it might have better performance or on par performance. It might do better at 4K. It might not necessarily do as well at 40p. But here's where Nvidia ends up dominating and why they end up dominating. Ray tracing performance, Nvidia wins against AMD by quite a bit when it comes to ray tracing. Now, this is universally agreed by a lot of people, but then the tech media, like Linus Tech Tips, other people, they say, oh, most people don't care about ray tracing. And they use various sources of information for that, or they justify it by saying most people don't use ray tracing. For instance, they're not wrong when they say that the vast majority of people don't use ray tracing, but the question is why? Linus Tech Tips, for instance, did a poll late last year asking people how often do they use ray tracing, and only about 13% of people regularly use ray tracing, and in total, only 36% of people, according to that poll, have used ray tracing at all. So, like over 60% of people have never used ray tracing, just don't bother with it. But that's not because they have the option of using ray tracing and are choosing not to. That's not the case. If we look at the Steam hardware survey and we look at the models of GPUs and we ask ourselves, like, where would you want to use? On what kind of GPU would you want to use ray tracing on? Well, you'll figure out that there's only like 12% of users, according to the Steam hardware survey, they even have a GPU that has good enough performance and good enough ray tracing performance to make it worth it. And there's only 40% or so of GPUs that can even use ray tracing at all, which ends up matching the figures that Linus ended up getting. Asking why people are not using a technology is just as important as knowing how many people use that technology. People use ray tracing if they have a GPU for it. But the problem is there's not necessarily that many GPUs to use it. Like, you have a couple of AMD GPUs, you have the 30 series, you have the 40 series, and it's not like all the 30 series and 40 series GPUs are it's worth using ray tracing on. Like, I would only go, like, the lowest I probably go with like a 3070, obviously for 3080, then 4070, 4070 Ti, 4080, and obviously 4090, and other higher models as well, like the higher models 30 series. That is basically it, and those make up about 12% of those. Only 12% of users, according to the Steam hardware survey, have those kind of GPUs where you have good enough performance that you're capable of taking a performance hit without it being a completely miserable experience. Then you have to account for how games are optimized, because a lot of games are very poorly optimized. This is not something you can blame on the hardware manufacturers. This is really something down to how the developers have handled games over the last couple of years, or in general, like optimizations of a lot of games, like AAA games. Like, you look at Hogwarts Legacy, you look at The Witcher 3 Next Gen Edition, you look at Cyberpunk. There's a lot of poorly optimized games that can look pretty good, but they're just incredibly poorly optimized. And hell, there's a lot of games that don't necessarily look the best and still run really poorly. Like Jedi Survivor isn't the best looking game out there, but it still runs really badly. They did a piss poor job with the PC version. And EA says, oh, people are using the wrong types of CPUs on the wrong operating system. That is rubbish. That is complete and utter rubbish. No, the game is just poorly optimized. And in fact, I think the game would have been poorly optimized on consoles because, well, the only reason it isn't is because they made a partnership with AMD, and probably AMD helped them out to get good console performance. Not that that partnership ended up giving any kind of good PC performance, even on AMD GPUs. Didn't work that way. So ray tracing, Nvidia has a significant advantage versus AMD. Of course, a lot of games don't use ray tracing, but if you're buying a new GPU right now, or you're buying a new computer at the moment, you should think about, how's the gaming market going to be in the next 2, 3, 4 years, right? Because if you're buying a GPU, a high-end GPU, or buying a high-end CPU, you got to ask yourself, is this going to be relevant for the games that are going to be coming out in the next 3, 4 years? And ray tracing, for the big titles especially, is going to be more and more and more important. Like, consoles have ray tracing, and you can expect a lot of the AAA games to have ray tracing as well. And as I stated, if people have GPUs that can use ray tracing with good enough performance, they will likely do so. At least that's what we can figure out according to the hardware survey and Linus's poll. Just an idea. Then there is DLSS. Now, plenty of people dislike upscaling as an option, but if you want to make your game look nice, like if you wanted to use ray tracing, if you wanted to use all the bells and whistles, then using upscaling, DLSS, really works out quite well. And a lot of games, far more so than ray tracing, are using upscaling more and more, be it FSR or DLSS. I think there's probably more games that have DLSS than FSR. But to be blunt about it, FSR is nowhere near as good as DLSS. And here's the thing about DLSS. It's not even just about the performance. Let's say you have a GPU that is capable of giving you good enough gaming performance by default, so you don't need to use upscaling. Well, there's another advantage to DLSS, or rather DLAA. See, DLAA is the best anti-aliasing method right now for any game. You don't necessarily need to use DLSS. Though in a lot of games, to actually get the DLAA effect, you're probably going to have to turn it on because they don't have the ability of just enabling DLAA. But if you can get the anti-aliasing benefit from DLSS, that significantly improves image quality. For instance, if I'm going to play The Witcher 3 or Cyberpunk right now, I'm going to turn DLSS on for no other reason than to get the anti-aliasing quality that DLAA is offering, or the anti-aliasing quality that DLSS has. So that is a significant advantage between Nvidia and AMD. Like, AMD is behind, and they're talking about FSR free and how it's going to be much better. But at the moment, as I'm recording this, there's no competition. And even if AMD releases FSR free and it ends up being an improvement, Nvidia is probably just going to make improvements to DLSS. They are ahead by at least 1 or 2 generations compared to AMD. That could change, to be clear, but quite likely not with the current GPU lineup. So if you're buying a GPU right now, when it comes to ray tracing, when it comes to upscaling performance, Nvidia wins by quite a bit against AMD. And then finally, there is frame generation. Frame generation is what makes this situation between AMD and Nvidia not be a competition at all. And it is a farce to argue that there is a competition. Frame generation uses AI to vastly improve your gaming performance, because what it's doing is it's using AI to generate fake frames. Now, people will talk about the input lag and how the image quality may be affected. Well, I've put in quite a few hours in Witcher 3, in Cyberpunk, in Jedi Survivor with frame generation. I can tell you that I did not notice a difference necessarily between them, at least when it was implemented well. And keep in mind, this is still the first iteration of it, and it's likely going to be improved. What does frame generation do? Creates fake frames, and this can double your frame rate. So if I'm playing, like if I want to play Cyberpunk right now, I can max out every setting on my 4070 Ti, including ray tracing. I can go with cycle level. I can't go with path tracing. That's a different discussion. But I can go with cycle level, ray tracing. I can max out every setting. I can at 1440p on my 4070 Ti, and I can get over 70 FPS with frame generation, which is double. If I'm playing Witcher 3 Next Gen Edition, where they brute force the implementation of ray tracing, HDR, etc., I can go from roughly 50 FPS to over 100 FPS. And didn't really notice a difference. Is there an input delay added? Sure, but you do have reflex mode that does help a lot with respect to that. And it's not like you're gaining that much of an input delay, to be quite honest with you. It's like I've looked based on what I've seen in Witcher 3, for instance, I've gotten like 20 to 40 ms in that game. It's not consistent. Like sometimes you get like 40, most of the time you get 20 or even lower. And you're looking at the technology that vastly improves the frame rate of the game you're playing. Again, some issues do exist. It's not perfect. And one of the things to mention about frame generation is you need to have a certain level of performance, innate performance, in order to take advantage of it. So if you are not getting already, let's say 50, 60 FPS before you enable frame generation, it is going to have some issues, but like it just makes the experience far smoother. I would much rather play Witcher 3 or Cyberpunk at a higher frame rate, even if those are fake frames, because it just feels a lot smoother. And my overall performance as a gamer goes up, because like when the game feels smoother to play, like when it feels like it actually feels more responsive because it's just of the higher frame rate, even if it is fake frames. But here's the insane part. Jedi Survivor also has frame generation available through a mod. Now granted, it is a paid mod. It doesn't have it innately. The engine could support it, but EA made a partnership with AMD likely to save their console performance, so it doesn't have DLSS. But the modder was able to add DLSS 3.0. It's only 1440p, it only works obviously on the 40 series, but it does add frame generation. And even through a mod, I was able to get anywhere between 50% performance increase to double the performance with the mod. That is insane. That is ridiculous. Now, granted, it's likely because of the engine, the Unreal Engine, which is a known quantity, which has a lot of tools, but think of the potential there. And this modder is also saying like Starfield, he's going to implement it in Starfield because Starfield may not have DLSS. We don't know for certain. Like if Starfield has DLSS, and obviously it's better if a developer implements it, and a lot of developers have implemented upscaling even when they haven't implemented ray tracing. It is becoming more and more the norm. It is a very useful technology that a lot of people use. And it's just like the 40 series right now, like I don't care what the performance is in non-ray traced, non-upscaled, when I can literally just enable DLSS, enable frame generation, and get double the FPS of what I was getting before. AMD can't compete with that. Just plain and simple. And if it's something that can be modded, then it's something quite a few games where you might struggle with performance may end up having. So, no competition. Anyone who says right now there is a competition, There are certain situations where you might consider an AMD's GPU, like if you're trying to save money but still get really gaming performance for a competitive environment. Okay, like for Call of Duty, for Counter-Strike, all that, there might be an advantage for AMD versus Nvidia. But if you're trying to play games that look really good, if you turn everything on, but also have good performance with ray tracing, with upscaling, with anti-aliasing from DLSS, and you want to just get good performance also with frame generation, yeah, it's not even a competition. It's not even close. It's not in the same. It's not on the same planet. That's the difference right now between AMD and Nvidia. Now, I want to be fair to AMD and say that they have claimed that their own version of frame generation, which they are going to implement in the future with FSR free, whenever that comes out, may offer frame generation creates one fake frame for every real frame. And I believe they have claimed that their own version of frame generation can create 4 fake frames for every real frame. What that will mean in practice, I have no idea. Like if I read that statement as face value, it's like, what is I'm gonna increase my performance by 4 times with AMD solution? If that's possible, then Jesus, that's insane. But we have to wait and see how that happens, assuming it even comes out anytime soon. We don't know when FSR 3.0 comes out. Like if I just Google the release date, it's like maybe late this year, maybe 2024. So just something to keep in mind, because if they deliver like on a promise, or even if they just release something that's as good as frame generation, let alone if they release something that's better than frame generation, then then frame generation is with DLSS, then yeah, AMD is going to win the GPU war and turn things around, and this video will be completely pointless. But I also have to say about this, I've heard a lot of promises from AMD over the years, like on everything, including FSR. Like, yes, they were claiming for many years, oh, FSR is going to be better than DLSS. It didn't end up being better than DLSS. And now they're claiming, oh, we can do much better in frame generation than Nvidia does. I'll believe it when I see it. If they do deliver, it is a game changer. And it might completely turn things around on the GPU side of things, as they did on the CPU side of things against Intel. Though I want to be also clear that AMD's success against Intel also came about because Intel really screwed up as well with the CPUs. Nvidia has done some really shitty things, but they haven't completely screwed up. In fact, while people are angry with the price points, understandably so, very angry, and they're angry because the performance hasn't necessarily increased from generation to generation, I think like Nvidia made deliberate decision to focus on the technology with each GPU release. And many people didn't necessarily care when they originally announced ray tracing, and yeah, with the 20 series it wasn't great, but Nvidia has invested in the future a lot. And I think that's really showing at the moment. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.